This video is brought to you by VolunteerAudio.com, your #1 source for all things Harley Davidson audio. From individual radios, speakers, and amps to complete plug-and-play amp and speaker systems, we've got you covered. And once you've ordered your package from Volunteer Audio, it includes lifetime tech support. And we have the very best step-by-step installation video so you can install it yourself and save money. So now that we've got our gas tank removed, we're going to unclip this cover on what we call the backbone. This is where all the wiring in the bike is already run, and the correct place to run your wiring from the front to the back. You don't want to tuck it under the gas tank, as a lot of people, we see them do that. It'll come loose, it'll fall on the motor, possibly get burnt or short, and we're just trying to make sure this lasts as long as possible with no problems. So on this particular model, you'll see we have a brake line because this has rear anti-lock brakes. Actually fishing in and out of here as well, so we're going to take that and just take it out of these little plastic holders. You're going to put this back at the end because this just protects the gas tank from damaging that brake line. All right, so we're going to get both of those loose. Now we're going to take these little clips on each side. Normally by now they're loose enough you don't need a screwdriver. You can also take a screwdriver, stick in here, and just get each one of these clips loose that are holding it. All right, so now you'll see all of our factory wiring. Now we're going to run our larger power and ground along with that backbone right in here and then snap this cover back on. All right, let's move to the front. We'll get our amp mounted and we'll start fishing this wiring toward the back. All right, so we put the new SoundStream Reserve HDHU 9813SG in this bike. And when you buy your amplifier from Volunteer Audio, we're going to send you some sort of mounting plate that has 14 and newer mounting holes on it. And with your radio received 4 of these little screws, these beveled screws that recess into that plate. So we're going to take the plate that comes in our kit. We're just going to set it on top of the radio, lining up those 4 holes. And we're going to take the screws that came with the radio and we're going to put those in place. Now you really don't have to have this plate. This plate is available, so we're using it, but the amp we're using does not need an aluminum plate to carry any heat away, so there's no real reason for it, other than to give us a good flat place for our amplifier to stick. The amplifier itself is going to be held down with an industrial piece of Velcro. We find this just makes it much, much easier to install. Anytime you're using these little screw holes, a lot of times those screws will get stripped and make it harder in the future to remove for any service work. The Velcro holds it really, really well and it's not going to fall off. All right, I'll finish up getting the rest of the screws. Let's get our amp and come back and we'll stick it on the plate. All right, so if you get the Hertz amp from Volunteer Audio, it's going to come already preset for the radio. It's going to be marked SS, showing that it's set up for the SoundStream radio. It's going to have this big industrial piece of Velcro on the back of it. Super, super strong. And all we're going to do is stick it to this plate. Now, if you did the MAA 4.400 from SoundStream, that particular amp, or the Precision Power Amp, will mount to these 4 screw holes on the outside of it. But in this case, we're using the Hertz one. So we're just going to position it in here, slide it back, lifting our harnessing up to make room for our amp to fit. Get it in there to the point that it's touching the gauges, or the back of the gauges. And just stick it down. All right, now that leaves us plenty of room for our fairing to go back on. Now it's going to be important that we properly do our wire management, that everything gets zip tied up and properly secured outside of areas where the fairing will go back on very, very easily. And what's awesome about this setup is it's completely plug and play with the new radio. I'll show you. So I had the radio just kind of plugged in to the stock harnessing here. We'll unplug that radio harnessing. You'll see we have these 2 big plugs that come on the back of the radio. Now on your new amplifier, it's going to come pre-done with a plug that will plug into each one of these. Now this particular bike did not have factory rear speakers, so this connector is not in the bike factory. But when it's not in their factory, we add on this. This is our backbone connector. This is what's on a 14 and newer bike to add rear speakers, so we add it into our harnessing. So we'll run a backbone up plug up here that will go back to feed our 6x9s that we're putting on our lids. That same style connector can be used for an add-on tour pack or any additional rear speakers that we're going to be doing. Now, we will not have a mating plug for here. This would be what would go out and feed the factory rear speakers. But again, this particular bike did not have any factory rear speakers, so this plug won't be used. But by using this front plug and just plugging it right back into the original factory harness, we've now connected our front speakers. So we are using the front factory speaker leads in the front, along with all of our power and ground, everything's hooked back up. So our amplifier now is actually fully wired to this radio and our speakers just by plugging those in. So now we'll run the rear speaker harness up, plug it in here, and run a new power and ground wire from the battery up and plug that into this part of the amp. And then we'll take this blue wire, which is our amp turn-on wire, and we'll plug it into the mating connector on the back of the radio. So now our amp turn-on is connected, front speakers are connected, rear speakers are actually signaled in and out of the amp and ready to be run to the back. So this is a very, very simple way to do it. At Volunteer Audio, we want to make it easy. We do all the hard parts for you before you ever get your shipment, including setting the gains and the high-pass filters on the amp. Now, other companies will send you out an amplifier. They may send you out a universal power harness, but they won't be sending you a full T-harness like this pre-done, and they won't have your gain set. We go the extra step, the extra mile to make sure that you have an excellent end result and the easiest installation that's possible. All right, so with our gas tank removed and this backbone opened up, this is our power and ground harness. It's going to go from the battery to the front. Now you'll notice we already sent it to you fully assembled. The fuse is already in the fuse holder. All your ring terminals already crimped. It's in an anti-abrasive or it's got a cover on it to make sure that we don't ever pinch it or cause a problem with it. All that's pre-assembled, heat shrink on the connectors going to the amp, everything plug and play. Very, very easy to install. All we're going to do is lay it here on top of where our battery would go. We're just going to feed this up to the front. We're just following this factory harness up to the front. We're going to stick it through, and we're going to make sure after we get it hooked to our amp that we just zip tie it to this and put it back in this tray to the rear. All right, so we're going to do the same thing with this harness. This is our rear speaker harness. This is what we call our backbone connector. You'll see it has the opposite plug of the one that's at the amplifier, the one with the little latch on it. We're going to run it back up here the same exact way, just right through the front. And we're going to go ahead and connect it up front, and then we'll come back and we'll lay it out where it needs to go in here and fully seal all this back up. So let's move back to our amplifier. So now that I've got my power wire and my backbone wire pulled into the front of the fairing here, we're going to find our two mating connectors. First off, let's find our speaker connector. It's going to go to the back and kind of untangle some of this. You're going to see they just plug in together and they're going to snap. At that point, it's a weatherproof, watertight connection. We're going to take our power and ground wire for our amp. We're going to do the same thing. It's going to run off over to this side and up. You'll notice you just line up the yellow wires and the black wires. This only plugs in one way. Squeeze really, really hard, and it's going to snap. Also a good weather-tight connection. We don't have to worry about water. Everything's built for a Harley. It's all designed to get wet and continue to work. So we don't have to worry about getting caught in the rain. All right, so now that we have that here, we're going to start just tidying up these wires, making sure that everything's not going to be in the way of our fairing when we go back on. Now, it's kind of key that you don't put too much bulk in this area. If it sticks out too far, you're going to have a hard time getting the fairing on. And even if you put your screws in and pull it in, it's going to have weird gaps where it goes together. These fairings aren't known to fit the best to begin with, so we want to make sure that we do everything we can to make it look good. So we're going to come up through here. We're going to take some zip ties. We're going to find some factory holes and some places that we can go through. Just finding where we can secure it, zip tie it, and then every time you put a zip tie in place, take your pair of side cutters and flush cut them. That makes them not sharp. They won't be sticking out and taking up room, as well as they won't be cutting you while you're trying to do this. We're just going to feed our wiring on around. Under the radio, we've got some room there factory. So when I'm doing this, I'm just going to take all the wiring, then I'm like, where am I going to put it? I'm going to try to properly lay it out here where it's the least tangled. Feed it in behind things like this big clutch cable here. I'm going to take these and I'm just going to wrap a wire around it so that it's a little cleaner. Put a zip tie around it there. And as I get to this clutch cable, because I want it behind the clutch cable, I'm going to take another zip tie, go around this bunch of cabling here. Make sure we still have our headlight wire in here. We still have room for that. And anything else you see that looks like it's out of place or it's not properly done, people have been working in this fairing before, had a previous radio installed in it, had another amp in it. We want to make sure that we tuck things up to where they're not hanging down where any of our bolts would come together. It's just going to make things much, much easier on you as you go back together and less likely to have any future problems. So each one of these is going to be different. You're going to have different scenarios, different lighting been added on. We'll just kind of use some common sense and secure things up out of the way. All right, for this install, that should be good enough because if we put our frame together, all this is going to stay under here. The zip ties are just securing it so it doesn't fall down out from under the fairing or get in the way of where any of this hardware would tighten it back up at the end. Let's move down to the side of our gas tank and we'll secure this wiring up in front and then get the cover back on. So we're just going to take this wiring that we're feeding down through here and we're going to put it up to this big factory harness and we're going to zip tie around it. We're going to do this a couple places. Then we're going to make sure that we work our wheel back and forth and that we don't have anything in a bind as far as wiring goes, because if this was a road glide, none of this would be moving and it really wouldn't be a concern. But as you do turn, you are moving this wiring. So I'm going to try to fully turn one way and fully turn the opposite way, make sure nothing comes unplugged. We have plenty of room for everything to move. All right, at this point, we're going to drop this in this backbone covered area. Just kind of starting at the front, we're going to put our cover over. Line it up, work your way toward the back, making sure none of the original wiring is hanging out. We also don't want to pinch it when we go back together. All right, so after all that snapped in, we're going to go back with our brake lines, putting them back where they go. This was, I believe, the lower one. Just want to make sure our lines end up back in this area and that there's no way that our gas tank will pinch that brake line when it goes back together. So now that we have both of these run out the back of our backbone, we're going to put our gas tank back on and secure it back in place. All right, so we're going to have to get down to the battery to hook up our power and ground wire to it. Now this bike has a ton of wiring, tons of added lights that's not normally under here. All of this that you see is normally not under the seat of one of these bikes. So we're going to carefully try to kind of move it out of the way so we can do the parts that we need to do. We definitely want to make sure that we don't mess any of this up. But I want you to know if you don't see it on your bike, it's probably because it's most likely not there. It's not factory. So we're going to take the two bolts out of the back of our battery tray. This is really just a battery cover. We're also going to unsnap the computer. Like this one has an aftermarket computer in it. It's not factory. We're just going to kind of bring that over here to the side. So the Thundermax actually in this one. Now at this point, since we've took our bolts out of the back, this tray we're going to slide to the front. As we slide it to the front, it's going to allow us to lift up over a metal tab that holds this down. So that's this metal tab right here. We're sliding this plastic part over it to get it out. That's give us access now to our battery. This is where we're going to hook up that power and ground cable. Carefully kind of pull it under all this additional wiring. I'm going to disconnect our negative. All right, so we're going to try to get all of this reconnected back in there all at once. Most of the time, there's nowhere near this many things on the negative post. All right, making sure we get that all the way tight. Our positive post also has quite a few things on it, so let's get it undone. Get our ring bolted on it also. All right, so while our battery tray cover's off, I'm going to go ahead and route our rear speaker wires, and we'll get ready to cut in our rear 6x9 lids.